The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Queen Camilla prepared for what would become one of the most talked-about moments in recent royal history. She stood before her ornate mirror, watching as her lady-in-waiting carefully placed the glittering St. Edward's crown upon her head. The weight of the precious metal and jewels felt heavier than usual that day, though she couldn't quite understand why. Outside her chambers, the palace buzzed with its usual morning activity. Servants hurried through corridors carrying silver trays. Gardeners tended to the immaculate rose gardens, and security personnel conducted their routine checks. Among them was James Mitchell, a seasoned royal guard who had served the monarchy for 15 years without a single blemish on his record. James had always been known for his unwavering dedication and strict adherence to protocol. His colleagues respected him, his superiors trusted him, and he had never given anyone reason to question his loyalty. But that morning something felt different. Perhaps it was the letter he had received the night before from his daughter Sarah, who was struggling to pay her medical bills despite working 2 jobs. Or maybe it was the news report he had watched about families losing their homes while the royal family's wealth continued to grow. As Queen Camilla made her way through the palace corridors, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors, she expected the usual reception. Guards would snap to attention, bow respectfully, and maintain their positions until she passed. This had been the routine for decades, a dance of respect and hierarchy that had rarely been questioned. The first few guards she encountered followed protocol perfectly. They straightened their postures, offered respectful bows, and kept their eyes fixed straight ahead as she passed. Queen Camilla nodded graciously, her crown catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. She felt the familiar sense of dignity and authority that came with her position. But as she turned the corner toward the main entrance hall, she noticed James standing at his post near the grand staircase. There was something different about his posture, something that made her slow her pace slightly. His shoulders were straight, his uniform impeccable as always, but there was a tension in his stance that she had never noticed before. When Queen Camilla approached James, expecting the customary bow, something unprecedented happened. James remained standing straight, his eyes meeting hers directly instead of looking away respectfully. The moment stretched between them, filled with an electricity that seemed to charge the very air around them. Other staff members in the vicinity began to notice the unusual interaction. Whispers started to ripple through the small crowd that had gathered to catch a glimpse of the Queen during her morning walk. The tension was palpable as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Queen Camilla stopped directly in front of James, her expression shifting from gracious acknowledgement to confusion, then to something approaching disbelief. In all her years as a member of the royal family, first as the Duchess of Cornwall, and now as Queen Consort, she had never encountered such a direct challenge to royal protocol. James felt his heart pounding in his chest, but his resolve remained firm. He thought about his daughter Sarah, about the countless families struggling while living in the shadow of such immense wealth and privilege. He thought about the promises of change that never seemed to materialize for ordinary people like him. The crown on Queen Camilla's head seemed to glitter more intensely in the morning light, as if reflecting the drama of the moment. She had worn many crowns and tiaras over the years, but none had ever felt quite so heavy as this one did in that instant. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of footsteps echoing through other parts of the palace and the gentle ticking of an antique grandfather clock nearby. Other guards began to shift uncomfortably, unsure whether they should intervene or simply observe this unprecedented breach of protocol. James knew that his actions would have consequences. He understood that his career, his pension, and his family's security might all be at stake. But something deeper than self-preservation was driving him forward. It was a sense of justice, a feeling that respect should be earned rather than simply demanded by birthright. Queen Camilla's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. She had been trained to handle many difficult situations, but this quiet act of defiance from someone she had barely noticed before caught her completely off guard. The weight of the crown seemed to increase with each passing second. The other staff members watched in fascination and horror, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would be discussed in palace corridors for years to come. Some felt a secret admiration for James's courage, while others worried about the implications for the entire royal household. As the standoff continued, Queen Camilla realized that this was more than just a simple breach of protocol. This was a statement, a challenge to the very foundations of the system she represented. The young guard's steady gaze seemed to see right through the layers of ceremony and tradition to something more fundamental about power and respect. The morning that had started so routinely was quickly becoming anything but ordinary, and neither Queen Camilla nor James could have predicted how profoundly this moment would change both of their lives. The tension in the grand hallway reached a breaking point as Queen Camilla finally spoke, her voice carrying the authority of centuries of royal tradition. "Guard Mitchell," she said, having read his name tag during their prolonged eye contact. "I believe you have forgotten your duties." Her words were measured and controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath the surface. James felt every eye in the corridor upon him, but he remained standing straight, his hands clasped behind his back in perfect military fashion. "Your Majesty," he replied, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart, "I have not forgotten my duties. I am simply choosing to perform them differently today." The audacity of his response sent shockwaves through the assembled staff. Lady Margaret Worthington, the Queen's private secretary, gasped audibly and took a step forward as if to intervene. But Queen Camilla raised her hand slightly, a gesture that halted any movement toward them. "And what?" Queen Camilla asked, her voice becoming dangerously quiet. "Do you believe your duties to be, Guard Mitchell?" The crown atop her head caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows, creating prisms of color that danced across the walls around them. James took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either seal his fate or open a door to something entirely unexpected. "My duty, Your Majesty, is to serve the people of this country. All the people, not just those born into privilege." His words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before a medieval knight. The silence that followed was deafening. Queen Camilla had faced many challenges during her time in the royal family, from public criticism to personal attacks in the media, but never had someone challenged her so directly while standing in her own palace. The weight of the crown seemed to press down upon her head with renewed force. "You speak of privilege," Queen Camilla said, her voice taking on a different tone, one that was neither angry nor dismissive but something closer to curiosity. "Tell me, Guard Mitchell, what do you know of the responsibilities that come with this crown?" She gestured slightly toward the ornate headpiece she wore. James had not expected this response. He had braced himself for immediate dismissal, for security to escort him away, for the swift and certain end of his career. Instead, the Queen seemed genuinely interested in his perspective. "I know that with great power comes great responsibility," he replied, drawing on words he had learned as a child. "But I also know that my daughter Sarah works 2 jobs and still cannot afford her insulin." The mention of his daughter's medical condition brought a new dimension to their confrontation. Queen Camilla's expression softened almost imperceptibly, though her posture remained regal and commanding. Around them, the staff continued to watch in fascination, some beginning to pull out their phones before remembering that recording in the palace was strictly forbidden. "Your daughter has diabetes?" Queen Camilla asked, and for the first time since the encounter began, her voice carried something that sounded like genuine concern rather than royal authority. "Type 1, James confirmed. "Diagnosed when she was 12. She's 25 now, working as a nurse during the day and cleaning offices at night. But the cost of her medication keeps rising while her wages stay the same." His voice remained steady, but there was an underlying current of pain that spoke to years of watching his child struggle. Queen Camilla felt something shift inside her chest, a feeling she had not experienced in years of royal engagements and ceremonial duties. Here was a real person with real problems, standing before her not as a subject to be acknowledged and dismissed, but as a human being sharing his pain. "And you believe," she said slowly, "that by refusing to bow to me you are somehow helping your daughter?" There was no mockery in her voice, only a genuine attempt to understand his reasoning. James met her gaze directly, his brown eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I believe that change only comes when people stop pretending that the old ways are working. When they stop bowing to a system that places ceremony above compassion." The word struck Queen Camilla with unexpected force. She thought about her own life, about the countless hours spent in formal ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, and state dinners, while real people struggled just miles away from the palace walls. The crown on her head suddenly felt not just heavy but somehow meaningless. "You risk everything by speaking to me this way," she said, though her tone had lost much of its earlier authority. "Your job, your pension, your family's security. Was it worth it to make your point?" James considered her question carefully before answering. "Your Majesty, my family's security is already at risk. My daughter rations her insulin because she cannot always afford it. My son dropped out of university because we couldn't manage the fees. What security do I really have to lose?" His words painted a picture that Queen Camilla had never truly considered before. She had heard statistics about poverty and healthcare costs, had even participated in charity events aimed at addressing these issues, but she had never stood face to face with someone living these realities every day. The other guards in the hallway began to shift uncomfortably, some starting to wonder if they too should question the protocols they had followed, without thought for so many years. The atmosphere in the palace felt charged with possibility, as if something fundamental was beginning to change. Queen Camilla looked around at the opulent surroundings, the gold-gilded frames, the priceless artwork, the crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. For the first time in years, she saw it all through different eyes. The confrontation had drawn the attention of more palace staff, and soon a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance. Among them was David Harrison, the head of palace security, whose face had grown increasingly pale as he watched one of his guards openly defy the queen. He began moving toward them, clearly intending to intervene and restore order to what had become an unprecedented situation. Queen Camilla noticed his approach and again raised her hand, this time more decisively. "Mr. Harrison," she said without taking her eyes off James, "please ensure we are not disturbed. I wish to continue this conversation." Her command stopped the security chief in his tracks, though confusion was written clearly across his features. James felt a mixture of surprise and relief. He had expected to be dragged away by now, possibly even arrested for his breach of protocol. Instead, the queen seemed genuinely interested in hearing what he had to say. The crown on her head continued to catch the light, but somehow it no longer seemed quite so intimidating. "Tell me about your daughter," Queen Camilla said, her voice softer now, more conversational than commanding. "What is her name? What kind of nurse is she?" The questions caught James off guard with their personal nature. "Her name is Sarah," he replied, his voice warming as he spoke about his child. "She works in the children's ward at St. Mary's Hospital. She loves working with sick children because she understands what they're going through. She always says that her diabetes taught her empathy." Pride colored his words despite the circumstances. Queen Camilla felt something stir within her as she listened. She thought about her own stepchildren and grandchildren, how protected and privileged their lives had been compared to this young woman, who had turned her medical condition into a source of strength to help others. "And your son?" she asked, surprising herself with her continued interest in this guard's family life. "Michael," James said, his expression growing more somber. He was studying engineering at Cambridge. "Brilliant boy, always building things, fixing things. But the fees," he trailed off, the pain evident in his voice. "He works construction now. Still builds things, just not the way he dreamed of doing it." The weight of these personal stories began to press upon Queen Camilla's conscience in a way that no briefing paper or charity report ever had. These weren't statistics or case studies. This was a real family whose dreams had been shaped by economic realities she had never had to face. "And you blame the monarchy for these struggles?" she asked, though her tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness. James considered his words carefully. "I don't blame you personally, Your Majesty, but I do question a system where some people are born into unimaginable wealth while others work themselves to exhaustion and still cannot afford basic necessities like medicine." His honesty was both refreshing and challenging. Queen Camilla looked around the opulent hallway again, taking in details she had long stopped noticing: the golden frames around portraits of long-dead royals, the marble imported from Italian quarries, the fresh flowers that were replaced daily at enormous expense. For the first time, she calculated what these luxuries might cost compared to a year's supply of insulin for a diabetic patient. "You believe that by not bowing to me, you are making a statement about these inequalities?" she asked, returning her attention to James. "I believe that respect should be earned through actions, not demanded through birthright," James replied. "When I see leaders who sacrifice for their people, who understand their struggles, who work to improve their lives. Then I bow willingly. But when I see, he gestured around the lavish surroundings, leaving his meaning clear without being explicitly disrespectful. Queen Camilla felt a flush of something that might have been shame, though she couldn't quite bring herself to acknowledge it as such. She had spent years in royal duties, cutting ribbons, attending galas, and making speeches about important causes. But how much real change had any of it brought to families like James's? "What would you have me do?" she asked, and the question surprised both of them. It was not the response of an offended monarch, but of a person genuinely seeking to understand how she might do better. James had not expected this turn in their conversation. He had prepared himself for anger, dismissal, or punishment, but not for what seemed like a genuine request for his opinion. "I would have you use your voice for real change," he said after a moment. "Not just ceremonial support for charities, but real advocacy for policies that would help families like mine." The idea was both appealing and terrifying to Queen Camilla. The monarchy had traditionally stayed above political issues, offering support but avoiding anything that might be seen as interference in government policy. But perhaps that tradition was part of the problem. Around them, the staff continued to watch in amazement. Many had worked in the palace for years without ever seeing such an honest exchange between royalty and a working-class employee. Some found themselves reconsidering their own relationships with the institution they served. Lady Margaret finally stepped forward, her diplomatic training overcoming her shock. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "perhaps this conversation might be better continued in a more private setting." Her suggestion was clearly meant to remove the audience and restore some normalcy to the situation. Queen Camilla looked at her private secretary, then back at James, then at the crowd of staff members who had gathered to witness this extraordinary moment. An idea began to form in her mind, something that would have seemed impossible just an hour earlier. "No," she said finally, her voice carrying a new kind of authority. "I think this conversation needs witnesses. I think perhaps we have all been living in isolation for too long, separated from the realities that most of our people face every day." The crown on her head seemed to shift slightly, as if even it was adjusting to this new perspective from its wearer. Queen Camilla's unexpected decision to continue their public conversation sent ripples of shock through the assembled staff. Several palace employees exchanged worried glances, uncertain about what this unprecedented break from protocol might mean for their own positions. But others found themselves leaning in closer, suddenly invested in hearing more of this honest exchange. James felt the weight of the moment settling upon his shoulders. What had started as a personal act of defiance was becoming something much larger, with implications he had never considered. The Queen's willingness to engage with him publicly was both encouraging and intimidating. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice gaining strength from her apparent openness, "if you truly want to understand the struggles of ordinary families, perhaps you should meet my daughter Sarah, not in some formal ceremony or photo opportunity, but as a real person with real challenges." The suggestion was audacious beyond anything anyone present had ever heard. Queen Camilla felt her pulse quicken as she considered the implications. Royal visits were carefully orchestrated affairs, with security briefings, planned conversations, and predetermined outcomes. What James was suggesting would be entirely different. "You would introduce me to your daughter?" she asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in her voice. "Even after this confrontation? Even knowing that it might change nothing?" James met her gaze steadily. "Especially because of this confrontation. Sarah doesn't know I'm doing this today. She would probably be horrified if she knew I had spoken to you this way, but she also deserves to have someone in power actually hear her story." The mention of his daughter's potential reaction reminded Queen Camilla that James was risking not just his own career, but his family's opinion of him. The courage this required was beginning to impress her more than his initial act of defiance. "And what would I learn from meeting Miss Sarah that I couldn't learn from reports or statistics?" Queen Camilla asked, though her tone suggested she might already know the answer. "You would learn what it feels like to choose between paying for medication and paying for groceries," James replied. "You would understand the anxiety of watching your child ration medicine that keeps her alive because the cost keeps rising faster than her wages. You would see the face of someone who serves others every day despite her own struggles." Each word painted a picture that contrasted sharply with the gilded world surrounding them. Queen Camilla found herself imagining a young woman in a hospital uniform, working long shifts while managing a chronic illness, trying to heal others while struggling to afford her own care. There are millions of families facing similar challenges, she said, though it sounded more like she was thinking aloud than making an argument. Exactly, James replied with sudden passion. Millions of families who feel invisible to the people in power. Millions of people who work hard and pay their taxes and follow the law, but still struggle to survive. When did we decide that was acceptable? His question hung in the air, challenging not just Queen Camilla but everyone present to consider their own roles in perpetuating a system that allowed such disparities to exist. Several staff members found themselves nodding slightly, thinking of their own families and financial struggles. Queen Camilla realized that in all her years of royal duty, she had never been asked such direct questions about the effectiveness of the institution she represented. Certainly, she had faced criticism from the media and public protests, but never had someone stood before her and challenged her to examine whether her work actually made a meaningful difference in people's lives. "If I were to meet your daughter," she said slowly, "what would you hope to accomplish? What change could possibly result from such a meeting?" James had clearly thought about this question before. "I would hope that you might begin to see your role differently, not as someone who accepts honorary titles and cuts ribbons, but as someone who could use her platform to demand real change, someone who could make it impossible for politicians to ignore the struggles of working families." The idea was both appealing and frightening to Queen Camilla. Throughout her time in the royal family, she had been carefully taught to support causes without advocating for specific political solutions. But perhaps that careful neutrality was itself a form of taking sides with the status quo. Lady Margaret shifted uncomfortably, clearly concerned about the direction of the conversation. "Your Majesty," she interjected carefully, "perhaps we should consider the constitutional implications of—" "The constitutional implications," Queen Camilla interrupted, surprising everyone, including herself, "of actually caring about the welfare of our people?" There was a new edge to her voice, a frustration that seemed to have been building for years. James felt a surge of hope as he watched the Queen wrestle with these ideas. Perhaps his gesture had not been in vain after all. Perhaps change was possible, even in a system as rigid and traditional as the monarchy. "Your daughter," Queen Camilla said, returning her attention to James. "Does she know about your financial struggles? Does she feel guilty about the cost of her medication?" The question revealed an understanding that surprised James. "Every day," he admitted. "She apologizes for being sick, as if her diabetes was a choice she made. She talks about stopping her treatment to save money, which terrifies me more than anything else in the world." The raw emotion in his voice seemed to reach something deep within Queen Camilla. She thought about her own children and grandchildren, how protected they had been from such impossible choices. The crown on her head felt heavier than ever, but now it was weighted with responsibility rather than mere tradition. Around them, the staff continued to listen in fascination, many of them recognizing their own struggles in James's story. The palace had always been a place where personal problems were kept carefully hidden, where everyone maintained professional facades regardless of their private difficulties. But in this moment, those facades were beginning to crack, and something more honest was emerging in their place. The conversation had reached a turning point, and Queen Camilla found herself making a decision that would have seemed impossible when she woke up that morning. "Guard Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying a new determination, "I would like to meet your daughter. Not as Queen meeting subject, but as one person trying to understand another's experience." The statement sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Lady Margaret looked as if she might faint, while David Harrison began frantically calculating the security implications of such an unprecedented meeting. But James felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine hope that his sacrifice might lead to meaningful change. "She works a 12-hour shift today at St. Mary's," James said, hardly believing he was coordinating a royal visit with a member of the monarchy. "She gets off at 7 this evening. She usually stops at the small cafe near the hospital to decompress before coming home." Queen Camilla nodded, her mind already working through the logistics of what she was proposing. "Then perhaps I should visit this cafe tonight. Not with fanfare or security details, but as quietly as possible." The idea of stepping outside the carefully controlled bubble of royal life both excited and terrified her. "Your Majesty," Lady Margaret finally found her voice. The security risks alone make such a visit highly inadvisable. And the protocol violation, she trailed off, realizing that protocol had already been thoroughly shattered by the morning's events. Perhaps, Queen Camilla replied. It's time we worried less about protocol and more about purpose. She looked around at the staff who had gathered to witness this extraordinary exchange. How many of you have stories similar to Guard Mitchell's? How many of you struggle with costs of healthcare, education, housing, while working in a palace worth hundreds of millions of pounds? The question caught everyone off guard. Several staff members looked at each other nervously, uncertain whether this was a genuine inquiry or some kind of test. But gradually, tentatively, a few hands began to rise. A young housekeeping staff member named Maria stepped forward slightly. My son needs special education services, she said quietly. But the waiting list is 2 years long. We can't afford private help. Her admission opened a floodgate of suppressed concerns. Thomas, one of the kitchen staff, added, My wife had to choose between her cancer treatment and keeping our house. We chose the treatment, but now we're facing eviction. His voice shook as he spoke. More stories began to emerge from the crowd. Children unable to attend university due to costs. Elderly parents who couldn't afford proper care. Families choosing between heating and eating during winter months. Each story added weight to James's original point about the growing disconnect between royal privilege and public struggle. Queen Camilla listened to each account with growing amazement and horror. These people worked in her household, served her meals, cleaned her rooms, and protected her safety, yet she had never known about their personal hardships. The crown on her head felt like it was burning as she realized how isolated she had become from the realities of the people around her. Why have none of you spoken of these struggles before? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Who would listen? Maria asked simply. And who would risk their job by complaining about their personal problems to the royal family? The honesty of her response hit Queen Camilla like a physical blow. She realized that the very system, designed to protect and elevate the monarchy, had also created barriers that prevented her from understanding the lives of the people she claimed to serve. James watched this exchange with a mixture of pride and apprehension. His individual act of defiance had somehow given voice to dozens of other struggles that had been hidden beneath the polished surface of palace life. But he also worried about the consequences for his colleagues who were now sharing their private difficulties. What if, Queen Camilla said slowly, we changed how things work here? What if instead of maintaining distance and formality, we created a way for palace staff to share their concerns and have them actually addressed? The idea was forming as she spoke, inspired by the raw honesty of the moment. David Harrison, still concerned about security, stepped forward. Your Majesty, with respect, such changes would require extensive planning and approval from multiple departments. Mr. Harrison, Queen Camilla interrupted, how long would it take to plan a simple visit to a cafe where I could meet Guard Mitchell's daughter? Her tone made it clear that she was not asking for permission but for practical information. The security chief realized that resistance was futile. If we maintain minimal security presence and avoid advance publicity, he said reluctantly, it could be arranged for this evening. But I cannot recommend it. Queen Camilla smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. Noted, Mr. Harrison. But sometimes the right thing to do is not the recommended thing. She turned back to James. Will you contact your daughter and ask if she would be willing to meet with me? Tell her honestly about our conversation today. Let her decide if she wants to participate. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. The Queen was not only taking his challenge seriously, but was willing to expose herself to potential criticism and security risks to follow through on it. I'll call her during her break, he said. But Your Majesty, Sarah is very direct. She won't hold back her opinions just because you're the Queen. Good, Queen Camilla replied firmly. I've had quite enough of people telling me what they think I want to hear. It's time I heard some truth, even if it's uncomfortable. The crown on her head caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, but for the first time that day, its weight felt less like a burden and more like a responsibility she was finally ready to shoulder properly. That evening, Queen Camilla found herself in the most unusual situation of her royal life. She sat in a small, unremarkable cafe near St. Mary's Hospital, wearing a simple coat and headscarf, with only 2 discreet security officers positioned at distant tables. The crown that had felt so heavy that morning was safely back in the palace, replaced by an even heavier sense of anticipation and nervousness. The cafe was nothing like the elegant establishment she usually frequented. The furniture was mismatched, the lighting fluorescent, and the air carried the mixed scents of coffee, antiseptic from the nearby hospital, and the tiredness of people ending long workdays. For the first time in years, Queen Camilla felt genuinely uncertain about how she would be received. James had called his daughter during her afternoon break, explaining the morning's events and the Queen's unusual request. Sarah's initial reaction had been disbelief, followed by concern for her father's job and finally a cautious agreement to the meeting. "If she really wants to understand," Sarah had said, "then I'll tell her the truth. But I won't pretend everything is fine just to make her feel better." When Sarah entered the cafe, still wearing her nursing uniform and looking exhausted from her 12-hour shift, Queen Camilla felt her breath catch. Here was a young woman who had spent her day caring for sick children while managing her own chronic illness, and the evidence of that dedication was written in every line of her posture. Sarah recognized Queen Camilla immediately despite the casual clothing and approached her table with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Your Majesty," she said simply, offering a small nod rather than the customary curtsy. "Please," Queen Camilla said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Just call me Camilla. And thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I understand you've had a long day." Sarah sat down, studying the Queen's face for any sign of insincerity. "My father told me about this morning. He's worried he'll lose his job, but he's also hopeful that you might actually listen. I'm not sure which feeling is stronger." The directness of Sarah's response surprised Queen Camilla, though she realized it shouldn't have given James's warning. "I want to listen," she said. "I want to understand what life is really like for families like yours. Your father mentioned your diabetes and the challenges you face with medication costs." Sarah's expression softened slightly at the genuine concern in Queen Camilla's voice. "It's not just the medication," she said, pulling out her phone to show a medical app. "I have to check my blood sugar multiple times a day, adjust insulin doses based on what I eat, how much I exercise, even how stressed I am. The strips for testing cost money, the insulin cost money, even the syringes cost money." Queen Camilla looked at the complex data on Sarah's phone screen, trying to comprehend the constant management required for something as basic as staying alive. "How much does it all cost?" she asked. "About £300 a month minimum," Sarah replied. "That's if nothing goes wrong, if I don't have any complications, if the prices don't increase. But they do increase regularly, while my salary stays the same." She paused, looking directly at Queen Camilla. "That's more than most people spend on food for their entire family." The number hit Queen Camilla with startling force. She thought about the palace's monthly flower budget, which was several times that amount, spent on arrangements that lasted barely a week. "And you work 2 jobs to afford this?" Sarah nodded. "I love nursing. I love working with children. But my salary alone isn't enough to cover my medical expenses and basic living costs, so I clean offices 4 nights a week after my hospital shifts. I get about 5 hours of sleep on those nights." The exhaustion in her voice made the sacrifice clear. "Don't you ever feel angry?" Queen Camilla asked. "About having to work so hard just to stay healthy?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I used to be angry all the time. Angry at my body for betraying me. Angry at a system that treats life-saving medicine like a luxury product. Angry at politicians who make decisions about healthcare costs while having their own medical care fully covered." She paused, taking a sip of her coffee. "But anger is exhausting, and I was already exhausted enough." Queen Camilla felt ashamed as she thought about her own comprehensive medical coverage, provided without question or cost as part of her royal position. What changed? "How do you cope with it now?" "I decided to focus on what I could control," Sarah explained. "I can't change the system overnight, but I can make sure the children in my ward feel loved and cared for. I can be the kind of nurse I needed when I was first diagnosed. I can show them that having a chronic illness doesn't mean giving up on your dreams." The grace with which Sarah had transformed her struggle into service for others moved Queen Camilla deeply. Here was someone who had every right to be bitter, yet had chosen compassion instead. "Your father is very proud of you," she said softly. Sarah smiled for the first time since sitting down. "He's a good man. He's worked hard his entire life, never complained, always followed the rules. But watching me struggle, watching my brother give up his education because we couldn't afford it, something changed in him. He said he couldn't keep pretending that everything was working fine when it clearly wasn't. Queen Camilla thought about James's morning defiance in a new light. It hadn't been disrespect for tradition. It had been love for his children, manifesting as a demand for change. He risked everything to make a point about inequality. He risked everything because he loves us, Sarah corrected gently. The inequality part was just the tool he used to express that love. Sometimes when the system fails people you care about, the only honest response is to challenge the system. The simple wisdom of Sarah's words struck Queen Camilla as more profound than any speech she had ever heard about duty and service. Here was someone who understood both sacrifice and change, who had found ways to serve others while fighting for herself. As they continued talking, Queen Camilla began to see a path forward that she had never imagined that morning when she put on her crown. 6 months later, the same corridor in Buckingham Palace witnessed a scene that would have been unimaginable before James Mitchell's act of defiance. Queen Camilla walked through the hallway, but this time she was accompanied by Sarah Mitchell, who wore a visitor's badge and carried a folder filled with testimonies from healthcare workers across the country. The crown was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Queen Camilla wore a simple black dress and a determined expression as she prepared for what would become known as the most unconventional royal address in modern history. The palace had initially resisted her plans, but her resolve had proven stronger than their objections. James stood at his usual post, but everything about the dynamic had changed. When Queen Camilla approached him, she stopped and extended her hand. "Thank you, James," she said simply, "for having the courage to start this conversation." James shook her hand, still amazed by the transformation that had begun with his moment of rebellion. "Thank you for listening, Your Majesty, and for acting." The changes had not happened overnight. Queen Camilla's meeting with Sarah had been followed by dozens of similar conversations with families across the country. She had visited food banks, homeless shelters, and community health centers, always with minimal fanfare and maximum attention to the stories she heard. More significantly, she had begun using her platform in ways that made palace advisors extremely nervous. Her speeches now included specific calls for healthcare reform, education funding, and policies to address income inequality. She had testified before parliamentary committees, not as a ceremonial figurehead, but as an advocate armed with real stories from real people. The constitutional implications had been debated endlessly in newspapers and academic circles. But Queen Camilla had remained focused on a simple principle. The monarchy should serve the people, not the other way around. Sarah had become an unofficial advisor, helping Queen Camilla understand the practical impacts of policy decisions on working families. The young nurse's insights had proven invaluable in translating royal influence into meaningful advocacy. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked as they approached the room where Queen Camilla would deliver her address to the nation. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," Queen Camilla replied, and she meant it. The woman who had once worn her crown as a symbol of inherited privilege now understood it as a tool for challenging injustice. The speech she was about to give would officially launch the Royal Commission for Economic Justice, a body with real power to investigate inequality and propose legislative solutions. It would also announce the Palace Staff Welfare Initiative, ensuring that the people who served the royal family would receive living wages and comprehensive health care. But perhaps most importantly, it would establish a new tradition, regular forums where ordinary citizens could directly address the monarchy about their concerns, with commitments to real action rather than ceremonial acknowledgement. James watched his daughter walk alongside the Queen, still hardly believing how dramatically their lives had changed. Sarah's medical expenses were now covered by a new royal health care program for public service workers. His son Michael had received a scholarship to return to university. But beyond their personal circumstances, they had witnessed something even more valuable: the possibility that entrenched systems could change when people found the courage to challenge them. As Queen Camilla entered the room where cameras waited to broadcast her message, she thought about the crown sitting in its case upstairs. She had decided that when she wore it again, it would carry new meaning. It would represent not the distance between ruler and subject, but the connection between a person with power and the people that power should serve. The speech she delivered that day would be remembered as a turning point in the modern monarchy. She spoke about James Mitchell's courage, about Sarah's dedication, about the hundreds of families whose stories had opened her eyes to realities she had never seen from inside palace walls. "A crown means nothing," she said near the end of her address, "if it sits on a head that refuses to see the struggles of the people it claims to serve. True royalty lies not in demanding respect through tradition, but in earning it through service, through advocacy, and through the courage to change when change is needed." When James Mitchell had refused to bow that morning 6 months earlier, he could never have imagined that his simple act of defiance would reshape the relationship between the monarchy and the people. But sometimes the most profound changes begin with one person deciding that respect must be earned rather than simply expected. Sarah had returned to her work at the hospital, but now she did so, knowing that her struggles had given voice to thousands of others facing similar challenges. The crown that had once symbolized distance had become a bridge, and the guard who refused to bow had helped build a new foundation for understanding between power and the people it should serve. In the end, Queen Camilla had learned that the heaviest crown is not made of gold and jewels, but of responsibility honestly accepted and courageously carried, and sometimes it takes someone willing to stand straight and look you in the eye to remind you what that responsibility truly means.